Is the ACLU now fighting against workers' rights? Writer Matt Bruenig reports that the Civil Liberties Organization is currently trying to destroy President Biden's National Labor Relations Board. The ACLU has gone to war with the NLRB over the firing of an ACLU employee who was terminated, according to Bruenig, quote, as the result of a DEI-crazed HR department. So to summarize, the ACLU fired a staffer for arguably laughable reasons. That staffer took legal action. Now the ACLU would rather undermine labor protections than admit it made a big mistake. Here to discuss this case in more detail is writer Matt Bruenig. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so there are probably very few labor disputes that would put me and you and Brianna, or me on the same side as you and Brianna, rather. But I read this and I could not help but chuckle at the DEI aspect of it, the reasons this employee was fired. So I want to get into all of that. Why don't you? It's a bit of a technical case. Why don't you lay out more substantially what's going on?
Yeah, so we have an employee here who's a staff attorney at ACLU. Her name is Catherine O, Miss O. She is apparently a bit of an outspoken worker. Her and some of her colleagues had complained about some managers. One of those managers actually got fired because of some of those complaints. And in this process, she, makes some statements that are not really a big deal, I think, to normal people, but were construed as racist by essentially the HR department and DEI officers at the ACLU. I'd say the two kind of most prominent examples was after the national political director of the ACLU left. This was following complaints that she and others had made. She remarked that even after his departure, the, quote, beatings will continue until morale improves, which I think is a Simpsons joke. And then the second thing was she had told some other supervisor, that her direct supervisor, that she was afraid to raise certain issues with him. And this was a black man. The other person, the national political director, was also a black man. And essentially for that reason alone, they said that these were racist remarks. They ended up terminating her. They have an arbitration policy where she could go to an arbitrator and try to get reinstated. She did that, but she also went to the NLRB, and they're trying to say that NLRB is the National Labor Relations Board. She went to the National Labor Relations Board, and the ACLU is now trying to say that she's not allowed to do that. She has to stick with the arbitration.
So what seems to be an issue is whether or not an employee can make a complaint against a supervisor, which I understood to be a protected action by the NLRB if that supervisor happens to be a person from a historically protected or legally protected group. That's a pretty significant question here, right? Can you complain about your boss if your boss happens to be black? What do you make of the NLRB's position here?
Yeah, it's interesting because you could imagine a conflict of laws here where the coworkers were collectively complaining about a supervisor in a very racist way and therefore creating a hostile work environment, which creates like a Civil Rights Act issue. And then, and the board has had to deal with that before, especially with picket line activity. Sometimes people will say very racist things on the picket line. But this is not that. There's no one's even claiming that this was a hostile work environment or anything that would create a civil rights issue. So we just have workers complaining about a supervisor, which is protected activity.
So take us through what's happening now. So the ACLU is trying to argue this doesn't belong before the NLRB in a way that you write would impact labor protections much more broadly. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the big thing is under current NLRB law, you have a right to go to the board to have unfair labor practices heard from. Even if your employer has an arbitration policy that says you have to go to arbitration for this or that, it doesn't matter. You can ignore that and go to the NLRB. They are now trying to say that, no, if we have an arbitration policy, and especially if you sort of partake in it, you're not also allowed to go to the NLRB. The NLRB has never held that ever. The board, in a 2-page decision, rejected that sort of in a preliminary way, but they're going to continue to raise the issue. These processes go on and on. So that is the big thing. They're going to try to, their arguments, if they were to prevail, would make it to where you would have less access to go to the NLRB. One of the consequences of that, which is very technical, is that earlier last year, the board issued a decision that said when you're having a union election, if the employer commits unfair labor practices, the NLRB might just come in and say, you have to bargain with this union. We're not going to do the election. You just have to bargain with them because you've committed these unfair labor practices. If they have an arbitration clause now, you may not be able to establish that they've committed an unfair labor practice, and now you can't take advantage of it. That was one of the Biden NLRB's big kind of decisions. So,
Matt, we opened by Robbie alluding to how this fact pattern here is making some strange bedfellows. Can you speak to the reaction to this article? What has it been like? Who have you heard from on the social media and beyond?
Yeah, I would say the first 3 or 4 hours, it was a bunch of left-wing, people posting it, labor people. Of course, that's who my following typically is. And then it just sort of turned in the middle of the day, and it just went all over right-wing Twitter. I mean, anyone you could think of. Eric Erickson, for whatever reason, stands out in my mind right now. I don't think he's ever tweeted anything I've ever written before. But yeah, I think, you have the left that is concerned about access to the NLRB and workers' rights there. And then you have the right who's concerned about overzealous, baseless accusations of racism. Here they kind of come together where you have an HR department that appears to be making essentially baseless racism claims because they don't like this particular outspoken worker. And so they're using that pretextually.
Well, and I also find it interesting because I've done a lot of monologues, or I used to do a lot of monologues on this show, a lot of writing about the trajectory of the ACLU, the perception that many of us libertarians, right libertarians and left libertarians, frankly, have about the ACLU's changing of it, or perceived changing of its stances. I would argue it's more than perceived, on free speech and due process, how they've weighed in on some of those issues over the years, becoming a little bit more less ironclad protective of those rights. Not sure today's ACLU would take the same position on the Nazis marching down the street or those kinds of questions. So it is interesting to see they're in actual legal practice them what is most important to them, and this seems to be a clear case of them prioritizing this sort of whatever you want to describe, DEI, nebulous racism, kind of that issue over some of its maybe more traditional protections for workers, et cetera, in a way that does speak to the concerns many of us have had about the ACLU over the years.
Yes, it's funny. The communications officer of the ACLU emailed me yesterday after my piece came out, and I'll read you one sentence there. It's funny because I don't really even talk about this in the piece, but it reveals perhaps some of their anxieties in this regard. She wrote, "In this matter currently before the NLRB, the former employee's right to free speech and her termination for cause should not be conflated." You've read the piece. I'm not talking about free speech, First Amendment, whatever. I'm worried about mandatory arbitration. But they are aware, obviously, that there is some contradiction here, not between constitutional speech protections, but speech protections that were established in the National Labor Relations Act that they are effectively trampling on.
This is fascinating, Matt. Thanks so much for joining us to discuss today.
Thank you.